Going into game 6 of the Fischer random match between Magnus Carlsen and Hikaru Nakamura, scores were level. Nakamura had hit back in game 5. So they played the same position in game 6 as in game 5. They'd had a little bit more time for preparation, and if you remember, Carlsen had played d4 in game 5. Here Nakamura opened with e4, which looks very logical. You move into the centre and you potentially open up lines for bishop and rook. e5, classical from Carlsen. Knight b3, that knight comes from the corner into the game. And now this is a very interesting move. c5. Nakamura said he hadn't expected this move at all. In fact, both players said that they were really on their own at this moment. So the little time that they had to prepare in between games 5 and 6, well, it really wasn't very effective at all. So they're just improvising at the moment. They're on their own. c5, of course, creates a weakness here, but Carlsen said afterwards that he didn't think it was that significant because this knight is a long way from that square. That's true, but this knight could possibly hop in. So knight e3 is a logical move, looking at this square. But the game, well, the position they've reached rather reminds me of a kind of close Sicilian, or a Spanish as well, like a closed Spanish position as well. So there are some similarities to normal positions. If bishop c4, it strikes me as a logical move to look at this diagonal and look at d5 as well, then d6, and black can always play bishop e6 to shut out that bishop. h4, well, Hikaru likes playing this and to perhaps use this rook in the corner, and Magnus, I think understandably, didn't want his rook to be locked in. If white gets in h5, then it could be very useful having that rook on h1. Certainly the rook on h8 doesn't look great, even if you castle. Therefore h5 I think is a very practical move, a good decision. g3 and b5. So yeah, it's looking very much like a kind of close Sicilian at this moment, although Carlsen said he didn't particularly want to play g6 because he felt that might give some kind of chances away for Nakamura to target f6. But Carlsen, to my eyes, played a very interesting move here. I mean, I think the normal move here would be to develop the knight in the corner and to play, for example, knight b6 or maybe knight c7. Knight b6 looks very normal. And this is absolutely fine. But instead of that, Carlsen played, I think, a very provocative move, bishop e6. I mean, normally, one says knights before bishops, because it's not always clear where your bishop wants to go, whereas for the knight it's a lot clearer. It needs to just get into the game. Why is this provocative? Because white lashes out with f4 to push that bishop out of the way. Of course, this is absolutely in Nakamura's style. He could simply castle here. The strange castling rules of Fischer random chess again. And maybe think about f4, but maybe just put the knight into d5 as well. So you could play in a far more positional way. But instead, Nakamura took the bait and lunged with f4. Now, if white gets in this nice pawn wedge with f5, then he's doing very well. So Carlsen took on f4, and he said after the game he thought he maybe overestimated his position. He wasn't quite sure about this. It certainly obviously becomes very much more double-edged with white having this nice pawn centre. But what's the problem with this? Well, of course, it does open white's king to a certain extent. It also leaves this pawn isolated, which doesn't look significant at the moment, but we'll see that black can target that pawn. But I think this was a very clever idea from Carlsen, because king slightly exposed compared to Carlsen's. And look at the position of the queens. Now, we've seen this in a few games so far in this match, that Magnus is really sensitive to queen position in relation to king position as well. So look at Nakamura's queen on b1, still rather locked in. However, with these pawn advances that Carlsen has made, his queen has far more options, and with an exposed king, then that could be very useful indeed. So, well, as we'll see, I think this was pretty good judgment from Carlsen. So knight b6, nothing too fiery happening at the moment. If f5, then that bishop will drop back, and black will be able to use, for example, the e5 square, and perhaps counterattack with c4 as well. And yeah, if that queen were over, for example, on g3, then this would be a very different story. But I mean, white certainly at the moment has no possibility to exploit that semi-open g file. So actually, black's king is quite safe here. So Nakamura, of course, was also appreciated that queen needed, well, improving, bringing into the game, and he played c3, which is the first step to bringing the queen out, potentially along the second rank. But that allows this nice opportunity, breaking up white's pawns, and yeah, well, this is actually a little bit uncomfortable for white. I mean, you don't really want to take here. I mean, I think black can recapture with either pawn or knight, and it looks quite promising. Just if you recapture with the knight, then the queen has perhaps the possibility to come into b6. Pawn is also good. So Nakamura played knight d4. So that got traded. So there's this huge clump of white pawns in the middle of the board. It looks terrifying at first glance, but actually it's very difficult to advance these successfully because it will open up the king. So bishop e7, a very cool move from Carlsen. Nakamura comes forward, d5, bishop drops, and now d4. So yeah, I mean, I think that's probably the best idea, to try and keep this diagonal closed. But queen d8, I mean, it's such an unusual position. Neither side really wants to castle and move the rook to f8. In fact, the rooks are probably best placed in these positions. So that makes for a very unusual situation when the rooks aren't actually connected. That's usually one of the things you try to do very quickly in classical chess. So yeah, a difficult situation, very unusual. Queen and bishop lining up against the h-pawn, and this is really strong. That pawn is going. And as I said, it's very difficult to use this seemingly very powerful pawn center. Rook attacked. Bishop g3. Now, he wants to just lock that bishop in with h4. That's what's happened. So even though Nakamura has advanced, at the moment it's not doing too much, actually. If this pawn, well, taking here would just wreck those pawns and open up the e-file. Dreadful. And it can't go any further. And yes, I think it is quite important that the queen actually has a lot of options in this position. Might go to the queen side on b6, might even come over to the king side via g5 later on when the position opens. Whereas white's queen, still not really in play. Rook f3 from Nakamura. Not a beautiful move, but he's trying to get rid of that bishop. Bishop c8, and Nakamura confessed after the game. He said, after bishop c8, black is just better. So what is black trying to do with this move? Well, first of all, it opens up the queen here. It's another avenue of attack. So introducing this idea, taking on e5 and potentially taking on d5. The bishop might even just maneuver around to b7 to attack d5. So knight f1, this is Nakamura's idea. He's looking at that bishop. Now, I think black has a number of possibilities here. You could take on d5, but then now the king looks a little bit exposed. It's not quite as nice as the last position. I think white would have some compensation there, but Carlsen is very sensitive to leaving his king exposed. Bishop g4, hitting the rook, which swings over. And I think now a very nice move from Magnus. Pawn to b4. So what's the big idea? Well, if that pawn is taken, then bishop takes b4. Bishop takes f4, and now white's pawn centre is just crumbling. I mean, if white continues on his merry way with the bishop, then queen g5. There we are. Told you that queen can suddenly shoot into the game, and moves like h3 start to become a threat. And there's no pawn cover. It's as simple as that. Compare the two kings. It's often the difference in positions. Pawn cover to the kings. So b4 just played, and rook takes a7, queen b8. So Carlsen had to make sure that this was kind of under control. You don't really want to allow a rook down to the 7th rank. And one line he had to check was this sacrifice with rook takes pawn. In fact, after e6, instead of moving back with the king, which might allow this queen to suddenly shoot into the game, the simplest is just to give a little bit of material back. And in fact, black is still the exchange ahead here and must be winning. So after queen b8, Nakamura played rook a6, which doesn't look beautiful, particularly after queen b7, and the rook is running short of squares. If rook a5, then, well, similar to the game, c3, and then the knight leaps into c4 and double attack. This looks rather unpleasant. So the game continuation after queen b7, knight takes bishop. So Nakamura gives up an exchange, but at least he's got the knight into a strong position. But look at that queen. It's still sidelined. You know, if you want to start an attack on your opponent's king, you've got to get the queen in the zone. But that queen is still miles and miles away. And now Carlsen, the exchange up. And yeah, around about this time, well, Carlsen had been behind on the clock earlier in the game. Now the times were evening up as Nakamura was trying to dig his way out of trouble. This very nice positional pawn sacrifice to bring the knight into this beautiful square. If queen takes pawn, then we get the queen in the zone, and that is just horrible for white. After knight c4, Nakamura pinned with bishop f1. In fact, of course, Carlsen had foreseen this, and he realised he could just trade off. And if bishop takes queen, knight takes queen, and black is a rook ahead. So knight takes knight instead. Queen game back to c8. So that was basically just a way of trading off one of the defenders around the king, and black still has a huge initiative here. Carlsen thought the last chance would be to take pawn takes pawn, because if queen here, then the queen can block with d3, but actually after bishop f5, for example, queen e1, then the queen comes to c3. I mean, there are other possibilities, but bishop f5 just looks like a very strong move, and sometimes that queen can even come into g4 again. So queen c8 played, and now rook h2, but that leaves black with a mighty pass pawn on c3, just to add to white's woes here. Bishop f3, threatening queen g4 check. So the knight covers. Carlsen exchanged on e5. So if d takes, then the queen comes here, and very unpleasant. And f takes played, and the queen slips over here. I tell you what, this game is really a tale of two queens. You can see the difference between these two. I mean, Carlsen's queen has he's been like the hardest working piece on the board. And actually, I'm not even sure that queen on b1 has even moved yet. Does for the first time now to stop queen g5. But, well, you can see it's all over. I mean, Carlsen is material ahead, and also with a winning position as well. And now the rook comes up to join the attack, and Carlsen just needed to negotiate a few little tactics. By this stage, Nakamura was down to his last few minutes. Carlsen had a time advantage. Rook f8, good move. Rook f5, just blocking out the attack. It's completely lost. Nakamura tried knight f6, but after that move he resigned. Why did he resign? Okay, let's have a quick look. Pawn takes rook. This is nice. Rook takes. And if queen takes, then queen d4, check, followed by queen takes pawn, for example. And if king g2, well, of course, you could take a pawn, but why not head for a winning king and pawn endgame after queen d5? White won't be able to stop one of those pawns going through. Now that was a fascinating game, a unique game. And I think, you know, over these last two games, we've seen, for the first time in this match, some very unusual and fascinating positions that have been generated from this Fischer random baseline. And I think two very well played games indeed. So there we go. After 6 games, Magnus Carlsen regains the lead. They play 2 more games with this slow, rapid time control, game 7-8, and then we're on to the blitz stuff with 10-minute chess. So look out for more vids tomorrow.